All right, so do a brief presentation on Uno. So Uno is this very popular card game, which shares its name with our own Uno in LibreOffice, which is allegedly this universal networks objects thing, influenced by Microsoft COM, Carva, Java, remote method invocation, and it's one of its selling points is that it supports exceptions. So what it isn't, and what's used inside LibreOffice as well is this command URLs where you can dispatch things to do insert graphics and all the other things you can do in the user interface. That's got Uno in its name as well, and people have called them Uno commands. So there's a bit of confusion there, but the Uno commands have really no relationship with Uno itself. So yeah, Uno commands are not Uno. Uno is a different thing. I guess the original motivations for this were broken into two categories. So I'll just take the first category here first. These are the ones that I'm kind of happy with. You can write, extensions for LibreOffice. You can use Uno to do that. And you can integrate other things like these correlates and all the rest in Java stuff into StarOffice or LibreOffice it is now via Uno. So what can you do with it? Sports remote calls. You can run Office with this accept argument. And then you can write a totally separate program that calls methods on local C++ objects, and it magically transports your calls across the network to the actual instance of StarOffice or LibreOffice, executes the calls there and brings the results back. So that's used quite a lot in GOD, document converter, and things like that. It's a very common use case to use a kind of a slave version of LibreOffice to convert documents or do all sorts of things, create templates, manipulate documents in all sorts of ways, and it's pretty useful there. And the other thing you can do with it then is for other languages. You can use Java components from as extensions. There's a scripting APIs. You can run Python stuff and all of that. Most of our core is in C++, but we have a few Python bits that are done by that exist by default. So your email merge is a Python component, and you just transparently call your C++ methods to do various email things, and it's all transported magically over to the Python implementation and so forth. But typically within your case of LibreOffice, if you're calling anything, what you're actually calling is another C++ object. In this case, then, the joy of Uno is that the idea is that you don't have particularly great overhead by using Uno if the actual destination is in the same environment, if it's in the same language and same runtime, etc., etc. You're supposed to just get a direct virtual call without any kind of serialization, deserialization, or any kind of issues like that. Practically, we have these IDL files, interface description languages, broken into three categories basically. There's this UDK directory, which is your kind of base bits that you need to do anything with whatsoever, kind of standard lib level stuff. Then you have this off API, the Office API, which is everything else, all the stuff you need to do for documents, Office Suite stuff, spreadsheets, all the rest of it exists there, and that's your huge directory. And then there's this an additional directory for some VBA stuff, VBA compatibility stuff, which is separate for some reason or other that I recall. So yeah, most of your stuff is an off API, and your base stuff is a UDK API. So practical stuff there. Practically as well, then we have these published ones and then these unpublished ones. The kind of published ones are meant to be unchangeable basically. Once they're published in that sense, extensions can use them, and if they were changed, then your extensions would no longer work. So once something is published, it's basically inflexible, and within that then your enums can't be extended either. So once you publish and you have an enum in it, you can't add additional ones later on. So if you are doing any ideas, probably easiest to avoid using enums and use constants instead. You can add additional constants without disrupting the existing situation. So you can add additional constants to something published, Once something is an enum and published, you're stuck with it. So yeah, avoid enums if you don't have to. These unpublished ones are normally free for all. You can change them or modify them in theory, but in practice, I guess we rarely do, given that somebody might use them if they are published. So you've got a certain amount of flexibility there. What always catches me with the basic types is that there's a whole bunch of obvious ones, bools, bytes, doubles. They all map from ideal to the obvious equivalent C++. Semi-obvious ones, your string turns into the LibreOffice RTL string, and any to the internal any class. Long maps to a 32-bit value, and hyper is your 64-bit value. The hyper is not immediately obvious, I think. A little sample. All this stuff gets compiled on it in some various foo that can be accessed at runtime. So when you call your method on your stub, it ends up in a place that has access to the type information and can forward it all to something that's typically arg specific. So it knows type information, it knows the arguments and the count of arguments that are passed to it, takes them all, serializes them, or puts them into a simple array and passes it to something else, which will then convert it to your Python calls, or serialize it and send it over the wire to something else, which will undo the whole process at the end. So the idea then is basically that from a C++ perspective, you have a little proxy object or a stub that you can call transparently from the programmer side. Then all this magic takes place to convert it and move it someplace else, do all this calling in a remote location or a different language and bring the results back. So that's all kind of perfect from your extension point of view and your scripting point of view. And then from the idea of extending it, if you've wanted to add something afterwards, the protocol is that you create a new service, that a new interface that implements the old interface that you want to extend, and then you add on your additional bits. So you have a degree of extensibility there. So that kind of is your stage one, the kind of uses of Uno. As I think everybody would argue, nobody would argue there's anything kind of unusual or wrong about that. But then the other aspect is the second set of motivations for Uno when it was introduced, according to the original documentation at least. Like back around 2000, take about 2 days to build from scratch. And if you were a developer inside the Star Office, you generally didn't build it from scratch yourself. Release engineering would provide these pre-built libraries, and everybody else would then just link against this set of well-eng provided libs. So as a dev yourself, you'd check out the one particular module that you're like implied to work on, writer, for example, and you'd link against those libraries for everything else. Occasionally, then somebody would add something new that you'd need to use in writer. So new API in VCL. So now you have to build a VCL and writer, but you're hoping that you can link against everything else that well-eng has already previously built. So what you had then ended up with the kind of infamous concept of a compatible build, which is where that you can make modifications and check them in. Somebody else can check them out and build that, but it should still link. Everything else outside of the few bits that need to be rebuilt should still link and run without error. So the compatible builds are where you make modifications like adding a non-virtual method to a class, and you can link and use those. But then if you do need to make incompatible builds, you're going to have to queue them up and let release engineering build them on a Friday, come back in the Monday after the 2-day build, and now you can make use of the incompatible changes. So there's a whole idea of like compatible changes and incompatible changes, and it was quite the big thing to make sure that you didn't check in a incompatible change on a Monday to Thursday basis, because then you destroy everybody else's ability to use the release engineer provided solver. So it's a real big thing in everybody's mind that the compatible build, incompatible build, don't make those kind of changes, and it comes very kind of fundamental to your day-to-day work. So that second group of motivations then, now that I've split out from the original Uno motivations, make a whole lot of discussion around, the advantage of using Uno was that after a change of classes, a new member or virtual method was added, the entire Office suite needs to be rebuilt. So you could avoid these problems if you use Juno everywhere. If you use Juno internally everywhere, you can hopefully avoid the issue of requiring these massive rebuilds if you need to add something to a method. And an additional ideas as well that it'd be great to have better documentation and better to understand things. But fundamentally, I feel that a lot of this was driven by the dream or hope that if you use these a lot internally, that you wouldn't have a lot of these circa 2000 um, build issues and link issues. And then, the description, goes more along those lines, that your minimal exposure to other modules. If you have to add an interface, new methods can be added with the existing class, and the new project can then use these new features without requiring these massive rebuilds. I think that second group of motivations, to my mind. So if you're looking at just an example of it, at least, if you had used the X calendar, use Uno, instead of a concrete implementation, and then take the concrete implementation, we add new methods to it, we add new virtual method to it, and now we've run into this incompatible build. But if in the first place we had used a Uno interface, an X calendar, and we needed to add something to it, we can create an X calendar 2 or 4 in this case, add your new methods to that, and anything that was using the previous version of it will still use the previous API without any difficulties, even if you have rebuilt the modules that now provide the additional fourth version of it. Theoretically, of course, you could even replace it by a different language and it would all still operate fine. But, and I guess this is where I kind of come to a close, is that first set of issues, first set of uses of Uno as this external peripheral interface, if we didn't have it now and we brought along Uno today and we said, this is a new thing we're going to add, and we said, could use it for extensions, scripting APIs, remote call support, I think we'd say that's wonderful. Let's go ahead and do that. And then if he suggested, no, let's use it all the way internally. Well, right now we don't have the same motivational things that existed at the start. So our rebuild times are an awful lot less. Like 2 days has gone to maybe 20 minutes. So that isn't the same kind of pressure that there was beforehand. The whole idea of incompatible builds isn't really a thing. I mean, end up using Uno because it provides a convenient way to have a virtual base class, and it's a convenient way for circular dependencies. But are they the kind of things that are enough on their own if you started now to convert everything over to it? I feel that you probably wouldn't. You'd probably just leave it around the outside, use it for extensions, use it for the external world to integrate with LibreOffice. But I'm not entirely convinced that you would do it now if you wanted, that you would use it internally now if you wanted those kind of features and support. But yes, and that's all I've got. Anybody got any comments on that?
Thank you, Caolán. Questions or thoughts? Attila?
No questions, thank you.
Okay. Thorsten, questions? Thoughts? Okay. Andras?
No questions.
Ashot?
Yes, I have one.
Right.
Caolán, was there relatively recently, at least, consideration for not necessarily replacing it, but considerations for alternatives for the future of the Uno interface, or maybe comparative study as to how did the technology evolve over the years? Is it serving us well still, or I mean, I know it's slow and it does have some rough edges, but do you have any thoughts on the future of this
Yeah, I
system?
don't really. I mean, one of the things is like I would rarely personally myself have decided I'm going to do something via Uno and go off and write the idea and do it that way. So for me, my interaction with it is if something is already in whether I would modify it in some way. So yeah, I mean, Stefan Bergman has done some great work to make it less clunky to use over the years. So it's far less miserable to work with it from Java and C++ than it was in the past. So that has improved, for example. Then I know with the kind of abstract take your UNO interface, maybe reworking various parts of it to use the concrete ones. I think Noel Graydon has been doing some work there. So instead of having a UNO reference to an X calendar in many locations, he's changed things to being an RTL reference to the calendar implementation, kind of keeping things as they are, but by taking out that kind of possibly unnecessary set of UNO direction. So there has been some moves there, but in a kind of a general scheme, I don't think there's any plans, and I certainly have none for anything kind of wide scale or whole scale.
I see. Thank you.
That-
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashot. Bayram? Cosmin?
No questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Darshan, questions, thoughts? Okay. Gokai?
No questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Gulsha, questions? Thank you. If I pronounce correctly, Ilmari, questions?
No questions. Thanks.
Thank you. John, my questions?
No
No questions, thanks.
Thank you. Michael, questions, thoughts?
Loads of questions and thoughts, but I'd be particularly interested to hear from Stefan as well. I think he probably has a huge amount of useful things to say. I think the dependency breaking function here is also something that may not be a build, may not help with build times, but it's certainly nice not to have to worry quite so much about compile time dependencies across the code base. So VCL can randomly use some toolkit feature. I don't know what it is, despite being underneath the toolkit in the dependency stack. And so I guess one of the most useful things there is kind of mashing up that, well, turning it all into a big glob of goo, if that makes sense. I don't know if that's not a technical term, obviously, but quite useful. And I wonder if there is a sort of way of replacing that. So obviously there are some things that go up and down the stack still, and that with C++ interface we could just provide those interfaces. But I wonder if there's a place for interfaces that sort of go in both directions, or whether it's a silly question and they just live in the module that's they're related to. It's probably a silly question, but but there are a number of interfaces. I think in LibreOffice Kit, for example, there's some that seem to be more decoupled and vertical throughout the app. I just wonder if there's a nice place like off API we can put those, or plans or thoughts from anyone on that.
I mean, you're talking about stuff that isn't UNO, that could be UNO.
Sure. It's using C++ types and normal memory sharing semantics, but not.
Yeah, I'm not sure off the top of my head, but I kind of feel that Noel has relatively recently added a few things, purely just to take advantage of that from UNO. They're not UNO in any other aspect, except that they've been put into off API in order to be available, before they wouldn't naturally be available if they were left as they were, to get around that kind of build time thing. I don't have an example off the top of my head, but it's been done at least. Whether that makes things even more kind of blurry than they currently are, I don't know. Just that you can use UNO, you do use just for that purpose, even though we've no intention of exposing it over the wire to a third party in any kind of that sense.
Yeah. I think the other thing is that I think there were reasonable things said in the past about if we use it internally, then we know there are scripting APIs for all of our new features, which is which is fair enough. I mean, one level, but
that kind of comes back to as well, I suppose, just the way things used to work at StarOffice as well, and that big vision would appear, and then that would be the vision for the next 12 months, and one of which would be to for example, to push to make sure that it was possible for external developers to make proper extensions. We built a bunch of things that as extensions that wouldn't have been naturally as extensions, but just done as extensions to prove that you could do important things as extensions, like the presentation console and all the rest. So yeah, the same kind of thinking then is make sure that this technology is reasonable and useful for scripting things. So we make sure to use it internally. But as you know, like our nothing wrong with the technology of but the actual little pieces that are available to write extensions with are kind of micro pieces that are really hard to do, applications with. So there's nothing wrong with, I suppose, itself. Maybe the APIs themselves then too fine grained for scripting purposes, or difficult for scripting purposes. So
Yeah, and I think the scripting use case is rather different, and performance-wise, like the how doing threading at the granularity of method calls is really tricky and unpleasant, I think, in many ways, and it doesn't lead to the best outcomes, and so we end up with APIs that try to do all things for all men, and then can end up not being very useful, and I think having them more focused on one use case perhaps would be better, but who knows. The other thing is that we have an SDK, and the SDK is great, but I feel somewhat directionless, at least when it comes to building sheet objects. Mike, go for it, interrupt. It's a whatever. If you
No, interrupt. I just wrote that I don't have a question, and after
fair enough. I think the SDK probably would benefit massively from some thought about how we can, create more beautiful graphic-y things inside documents and so on. Render this nicely. Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it?
Because the SDK, I suppose, at the time was very Java. It was very Java focused. I'm not too sure where people are, if they were writing extensions, or are they more likely at this stage to want to write them in Python rather than Java, or Java still a major thing for that? I'm entirely sure.
Not clear to me. Anyway, thanks for the talk. Well, good stuff. More heckling required, I think, as we go through.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Thank you, Caolán. Neil, questions?
No questions.
Okay, Pedro. No questions. Rush, questions? Okay, Sarper. Thank you, Stefan.
Stefan, we need to hear from you. You're muted. No, come on. Say interesting things. You have so much to say. Oh, no.
Can you hear me, actually?
Yes, we can. Yes.
Bit noisy here. I have no questions, but just one comment maybe on the reasons why we have this internal usage might not only be motivated by the build times back in the day, but also this kind of tension. If you want to have a decent interface for extensions, then you need to make sure that internal stuff or enough of the stuff is available to the outside. And I think that also added to some trend back in the day to also make to default to make things into components so that they could be used by scripting or extensions, even if nobody ever came around to use them in those places. So there was maybe some shift too far into making everything into components, but motivated in part also by having all these things then available to the outside and not hiding it.
Yeah.
One of the things we didn't mention, Stefan, was the apartment stuff, and sort of using, as a positive way to try and get rid of threading nightmares. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that or the latest
status.
Kind
of a failed experiment.
Oh,
I don't think it actually even 100% works in the case where Caolán's edited back then for the database stuff, and I think we're still having issues there, tricky things. So I think it never worked out the way.
Oh, shame. But the idea was to use the bridging essentially to push things into other threads or straddle across threads to make it easier to write thread-safe code But I guess the granularity of the API is not really message passing. They're very, very granular, I guess, because of the threading concerns. You can iterate and index a list of things, but the list can change underneath you. So,
yeah. So that's a fundamental design problem in this thing, that it's based on these independent objects that can be called from multiple threads independently, which is a design bug or a problem. Yeah.
Sure. And it's hard to know what to do about it. I mean, it would be wonderful if the apartment thing seemed okay, I guess, to serialize. Well, I don't know. Yeah. Who can say? What we really need, though, is a collaborative editing suite. So it's not just multiple threads; it's multiple users currently using APIs that weren't designed for it. But that's what we need. But hey, cool. Sorry, Ash, you were trying to get in.
No. Yeah, I have a question. I mean, related to this, maybe. I was actually wondering if with all the improvements to the C++ language, if there could be a way to leverage a faster, let's say, interface to the UNO world from C++, so that we don't pay the penalty of going through all these, the layers of abstraction and querying interfaces and whatnot, but at the same time, having the full benefit of the UNO layer. So Python and VB script or Java would still work the same way. Are there any thoughts from people in this group on how we can avoid that penalty of the abstraction from C++ without losing flexibility?
So Stefan did that, right? Like I think we have the service concept. You want to explain that, Stefan? Is it services, or I forget what it is, but you.
Yeah, but I'd say that's something different than what Ash asked for. So if I got the question right, I think no, we never.
The thing is, Ash, that like the overhead is low, like it's the cost of a virtual function call, C++ to C++. So, could be a lot worse. And I think, I swear, Stefan did something clever with grouping interfaces together, so you could see something, and then you could have a C++ class that was that group of interfaces. Is that right, Stefan? So you can avoid lots of query interfaces.
Yeah, there was this. Back then introduced with multiple inheritance, which is used then by services. Yeah, that's true. So yeah, for the querying part, we get rid of some of it with a multiple inheritance thing that should have been there from the outset and wasn't. So there's maybe cases where you still need query interface because they were separate interfaces when they could be combined under one combined inheritance thing. Yeah.
Oh, that does sound like something very similar to what I had in mind.
Then I didn't get your original.
No, that's fine. Do we have an idea of what roughly the cost is? I would imagine with multiple inheritance, it's just a pointer arithmetic and then a virtual call. Although there might be two indirections, but do we roughly know if it really boils down to, let's say, bare bones C++ overheads, or are there any other?
Yeah.
That's what it is.
C++.
Okay, that's beautiful. That's great. So yeah, I guess what I was hoping for is already there, and you've already done the work. Thank you.
I guess there's more to be done there to make sure that where we have groups of interfaces that are common, that there is a service for that, or I forgot what the description is, and that's used instead of doing these query interfaces between lots of things that are all the same. But yeah,
that makes
I guess
sense.
the archetypal problem of Uno is also its great strength. So you can do all this wonderful decoupling up and down the stack using these interfaces. But then how do you find the implementation? You know, like, I mean, it's extremely abstract, but there's a lot of sort of git grepping for, oh, well, you know, it uses a property bag. Great. Say, but where, you know, everyone uses a property bag. Say, which object is it? And of course, things like X-ray, I think, can really help give you a feeling.
Yeah, absolutely.
Of what's actually going on. Yeah. Cool.
Okay.
So Stefan, is it fair to say there's a consensus that we should be using, you know, primarily for scripting and not much more?
Yeah, I guess that's modulo what I said. If you don't expose anything for scripting, then
yes, of course,
it's not worth it either. So I think there's always this tension of thinking about implementing something as a Uno interface or not. And as time shifted, as time went by, it shifted in the one direction or the other, the trend of the day. And
yeah.
That's what we have now. Yeah.
So what about the toolkit APIs? Or maybe, you know, because I don't know. Anyway, there's a lot of sort of more or less grisly API bits that would be lovely to get rid of, but we can probably talk about this some other day we go to a Turkish bath or something and talk about the really tricky bits. But yeah, fantastic.
Okay, thank you. Mike, did you want to say something? I see again your head.
Yeah. I wanted to say something. I wanted to mention that about trading issue that Michael mentioned. I work with case of use of writer using Java, and the listener runs in a separate thread. So Java, basically Java calls all run in a separate thread. And in fact, that creates a lot of headache about this multi-threaded access to the same document from different threads. Actually, it makes me to lock left and right, or to pass all calls to the main thread, basically making it single-threaded. So we really don't have robust multi-threaded implementation, at least at some areas. And also, I wanted to say that Uno has, as Stefan mentioned, there were two reasons to expose something. One of them is just to make something accessible from scripts. And sometimes, so we have basically two big groups of Uno objects that may be created. One of them is something representing, one of them is a Uno interface that is implemented in the really used object in our code base, something like documents. They are both the objects doing the real work and the objects that implement the interface. And there are other Uno objects that are created just as artifacts to provide the access to other objects. Like, for instance, ranges in calc. When a code requests a Uno object for a range, each time, even for the same range, a new Uno object would be created. And when you compare these two Uno objects, they would be not the same. So there are many issues with the use of Uno, both in our code base and in extensions. So it is very difficult for users, even externally, to use it. Thanks. That's all from me.
Thank you, Mike. Okay, Vivek, do you have any questions?
No questions. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Kellen, and thank you everyone for joining. See you next week. Bye bye.
Thanks, Caolán. Good stuff. Good to see everyone. Happy hacking.
Thank you.
Bye.